Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, as the longest government shutdown in U.S. history rambles on, one really has to ask the question regarding just how economically and financially bankrupt America really is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's enough reason to believe that there was a desire to have this government shutdown in place as long as possible to hide a whole bunch of really bad problems. And so they could use the cover of a government shutdown to highlight the fact that they're struggling to plug gaps in the economy and in fiscal spending, etc. I mean, and therefore on that basis, there would come a point when clearly the government shutdown has to end. And the logic is it will only end when they feel they've managed to avert a crisis leading to total insolvency or bankruptcy by kicking the can down the road a few weeks, a month or two, perhaps. And that's why I think that it's a good discussion point because there is enough evidence to support that viewpoint that it was be very convenient for them to be able to blame a whole bunch of problems that they couldn't resolve immediately on the basis of, well, there's a government shutdown, so there's nothing we can do about this. So Ken and I are going to go through a list of points that we think supports that belief.
Yeah, it was really interesting, especially over the weekend. We always have to take things with a grain of salt when the president blasts something out on social media or even at an interview or press conference. But he has said this in the past, and now he's putting a number to it. In particular, due to the quote unquote tariff revenues we've received, we are focusing on providing $2,000 to most Americans. Now, just like during the pandemic when they did the stimulus checks, most Americans really means those who are in the taxpayer database. The IRS has the list of everybody who is receives an income, so that's how it's going to be paid out. But that's just one thing. In particular, as well, with the one stigma that the Democratic Party claimed was to be their bugaboo to stop the shutdown. It was funding and the all the complementary funds to keep the healthcare system that they had passed earlier going. Trump is trying to supersede that now by suggesting they make direct payments to people. So this is two instances of the government doing a form of, well, what they say UBI, of the government having to fund the people to keep them to sustain their way of life.
Yeah, I mean the $2,000 basically checks. If we do the simple maths, and let's just say even it would benefit 150 million Americans. Well, that would be $300 billion. There's no way the tariff revenues could just all be spent on giving all this money back to the people when the whole point of having these tariffs was to try and plug gaps in fiscal spending. And therefore, on that basis, the question is, where's the money coming from? And is this a way of trying to placate the masses because there are serious, serious problems bubbling below the surface? And, when you have situations with this debacle in Germany where they were telling US forces to go to food banks because they're not paying them. Now, you might have a government shutdown, but why are you having situations where government employees don't get paid? Is this because there is a major problem that they can't fix in real time? They then gave themselves this window of X number of weeks to say, well, we're going to have to find a temporary solution to deal with the fact we are insolvent, we are bankrupt, we can't pay these people. Okay, we can't pay these people for now, but let's find some kind of workaround on a temporary basis and to alleviate that problem. And it's not going to make the problem go away, but the fact you would tell forces in Germany to go to food banks to feed themselves just shows how desperate a situation it is, that you can't even finance your military wherever they are in the world. That is very indicative of the fact that the United States is utterly insolvent. There's also the issue, and Ken made this point before we came on air, that you've now got food bank demand in major cities in the US has doubled or tripled since this government shutdown. It just highlights what an absolutely horrendous situation huge amounts of Americans now find themselves in trying to obviously just get by on a day-to-day basis. And this is why cost of living now is by far and away the biggest challenge Americans face. There was surveys done of US adults in the age of range of 18 to 64, and basically nearly 50% said cost of living is their biggest problem. And there's no doubt that would absolutely be the case. So it's another example of the fact that the United States is teetering on the edge of economic financial oblivion, and in situations where you have a government shutdown and then government employees are not being paid, they just live on a hand-to-mouth existence. But if you haven't got the money to pay them on a temporary basis, and it comes back to the fact people say, oh, well, they can just print money. Well, you can't just print money anymore. It's just not working. Simply on the basis the United States has to be extremely careful now about debasing the currency to the point of destroying it. So, but they're having to find some workarounds to alleviate the problem sufficiently so they can then go, right, we've averted a crisis. And the crisis is probably far more than just an issue of fiscal spending. It could well be a crisis that also engulfs the financial system. This is the time of year, October, November time, when major problems happen. And they could use the cover, as we said, of this government shutdown to try and hide problems. Also, for example, the issue of food stamps, where they're trying to avoid having to shell out money for what now 42 million Americans who are living on the breadline, quite literally. Uh, and this again is indicative of the fact that you have a government now that is living a hand-to-mouth existence, that it quite literally can't pay its bills anymore. And that, yes, there's been problems historically with this, with the US running fiscal deficits, etc. But it's become so acute now that they are not in a position anymore to be able to do anything meaningful. So they're having to make decisions that are extremely unpalatable. And I know there's people say people shouldn't have food stamps. We're not here to debate whether people should have things or shouldn't have things. What we're saying is people are entitled to that, whether you agree or not, and they're not being paid. And again, it's like not paying your forces in Germany. It's access to food banks. It's this healthcare crisis that they're trying to avert. And therefore, on that basis, it just starts to paint a picture that of a government that is desperate, is bankrupt, is insolvent, hence going to the South Koreans going, give us 350 billion and we can spend it on what we like. That's the biggest indication from a foreign policy perspective that the US is bankrupt, is reached the end of the line, and hence why you could use the cover of this government shutdown to try and somehow find a way to keep things going for a bit longer. But that is not a solution. It's just a temporary stopgap to try and say, okay, what can we do to try and alleviate the fact that we've run out of road? We have run out of the ability anymore also to weaponize the dollar. And that was always the safety net for the US in the past, and that no longer is in place. So they're now staring down the barrel of a gun.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's something we never really talked about, but it popped up maybe a few weeks ago. Is that the United States military, the Pentagon, was seeking funds from private equity to help rebuild the military. I mean, think about that. The government has a $1 trillion budget, and that's still not enough. And they desperately need private equity to come in and sustain them. Not necessarily giving in money, but some of the technologies, give us free, an AI infrastructure boost when you guys, finish it, that type of thing. It's really fascinating when you take a look also. There are some major political ramifications that are coming that we've just seen, obviously. New York City, the financial capital of the United States, and for all intents purposes of the Western world, the voters have claimed erroneously that capitalism has failed, even though most of the West has not been truly capitalist for a long, long time. So instead, they take these bankrupt states, New York, California, Illinois, they have budget deficits, they have budget debt, and yet they want to pursue more and more and more free stuff and socialism and all this. When consumers and the average person has reached the point that they're willing to give away a lot of the freedoms that their forefathers fought for just to have, a page, to get a, subsidy month to month, then you know that the entire fabric of the social and economic system of that country is deteriorating almost to the point, probably to the point, I will say it, of no return.
Well, yes, exactly. And another thing that's worth mentioning geopolitically is the fact that the delivery of US weapons to NATO for Ukraine has been suspended because the US government shut down. Now, there's no logical reason why that's the case because Europe's supposed to buy the weapons and then give them to the Ukrainians so the US can claim we're not arming Ukraine. The reason the United States wants to walk away from this financially and not give them a dime is because they can't do it anymore because they're bankrupt. So, and the fact they're not prepared to send the weapons to the Europeans, well, it looks to me more importantly that the Europeans have got no money to pay for the weapons. So the United States is not going to give up weapons for nothing, even if it's for the Ukraine war. But again, it's anything that involves expenditure on the United States' side. They can't afford to do this, so they have to take these measures. And, how long is that going to continue? Well, okay, the government shutdown will end at some point, maybe sooner rather than later. But it doesn't detract from the fact that they're now making these serious decisions where they're behaving quite literally like a third world country that is ready to get a knock on the door from the IMF and the World Bank to say, sorry, it's over. You're in default. Okay, the US won't default in that respect, but to all intents and purposes, that's in essence where the United States now finds itself.
When you have the empire, the hegemonic empire, post World War II in the United States, we've suddenly seen also, and I think this is a really big key, is that the political environment, the politicians themselves, no longer have the intelligence or the fortitude to do what is necessary. Obviously, Ronald Reagan was crucified early on when he worked with Volcker to force a recession, a hard recession, necessary recession. And he knew politically it was going to be for all intents and purposes, suicide. But it was necessary, and it led then to growth and the United States moving out of the doldrums. Well, today, and especially since 2000, 2002, both 2000 and 2008, we don't have the political wherewithal in the government or in the banking system to be able to do what's necessary to allow all the toxicity and all of the things that have brought us to here to the brink to be dissolved, and for the people to have to go through that little bit of period of suffering. You see it in Europe. They're not willing to give up their pensions. They're not willing to give up their shortened work weeks. They're not willing to give up their health care. They're not willing to. We see this in the United States. God forbid, our subsidies and all this. It has gotten to the point that all the politicians' promises to pander and buy votes and the net necessity of the central banks to have to fund and subsidize every single industry and every single country. That can was kicked down through QE, QE2, and the whole 9 yards. But now it's reached that final point, and I really don't think that there's anything left that is going to stop it, and it's going to be a forced pressure to release it rather than having the politicians do what they have to do, no matter if they lose their time in office to get it right.
Well, yeah, but as well as their fear of their own political careers ending, when then, they're that gravy train ends for them. The other problem is they're terrified of what the American people will do if they get pushed into a corner and they have serious, dire economic and financial situation unfolding. Because you know, the Americans' population has hundreds of millions of guns. And if you push back them into a corner and they're ending up destitute, as someone said to me a decade ago, who was involved in US politics, the thing we fear the most is when the masses turn on us because they're destitute, because they've got nothing. So that's also why they will keep just bailing everything out. But there comes a point, clearly, when that's no longer feasible. But for now, the Trump administration has to try and keep the wheels turning. So they'll have tried to find some clever way of circumventing the problems on a short-term basis. At some point, the government shutdown will end, but the problems will carry on. But then they won't be able to use the cover of a government shutdown anymore. Because as well as shutting down, there are, of course, ramifications that you can make things 100 times worse by the government shutdown continuing for another month or 2 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever it might be. There comes a point when you can't do that either. But there's no doubt the US is desperate. It's running out of road. It's running out of its capability to try and manage this problem. So they will go to the world and beg for money. I mean, hence why I think Trump's come out and gone, we're going to have an injection of 20 trillion into the US economy by year end. It's absolute nonsense. What 20 trillion? Again, it's all just trying to pretend there isn't this huge problem that isn't going away. There is means the United States is bankrupt, is insolvent, can't pay its bills anymore. Does the world's rejecting the dollar, which makes things 100 times worse. And this is just another example. And it kind of ties in a bit with what, well, to quite a significant extent, what we talked about last time. And that's why I think it's worth also mentioning this in the context of the US and why the government shutdown for me is a clear smokescreen to hide the fact that the US is on the knife edge of total bankruptcy, insolvency, and the whole government and collapsing as a result of it.
Yeah, and because the entire Western economic system, Europe, Japan, Korea, are all intertwined with that. When one domino goes, many of the others. There was the talk in 2008 that central banks, lashed themselves together to make themselves stronger. We'll make sure swap lines protect Japan. We'll make sure swap lines protect Europe, and vice versa. But the other side of the coin is when you lash yourselves together, when the storm hits, everybody goes down because they have no capability of disconnecting. The final point I want to go ahead and make is that about 3 years ago, gold and silver prices in Europe, in euros, as well as in yen, were at all-time highs. It wasn't that way in the United States. Now, the United States has all-time highs, or, relatively close to all-time highs in gold and silver prices. The barometer is screaming just how bad things are. And they're even to the point that they can't even control it using the paper markets. And when that happens, that's been the biggest barometer financially for any nation, probably going back to the 1800s. So it's definitely something to watch. Paul, were there any final remarks you wanted to add to this?
No, I think that's enough to get the point across.
To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.